Okay, grade 8, chapter 10, Algebra. Final exam. This is the answer key for it. So if you're doing your what I should have done and what I did do right now, make sure you utilize the pause button to your advantage. Don't just go to the end and just copy things down. Make sure you listen to the explanation as well. Don't just fast forward to the picture frame that has all the answers and copy down. Listen and understand it, because I don't want this just to be, I'm going to get my extra 3 or 4% by copying it down. I want you to learn from your mistakes. So the first questions that we have, again, are the true-false. And historically, the true-false are the most difficult questions on our test, because even if you guess right, if your explanation wasn't what I needed to see, you lost full marks on it. So the first question in the expression x over 4 minus 4, the coefficient is positive 4. The answer is false. And the best way that I would draw it or explain it is to show that from a modeling perspective, that's what this is. And therefore, the coefficient, or how much x you have, is 0.25 or a quarter, not 4. So how much of x you have in that expression is not 4 x's, you have a quarter of x. So therefore your coefficient is 0.25 or 1/4. In the second question, it says the first step I should do in the equation -2 equals 4 minus 5x is add 2 to both sides. The answer for this is false. When you look at this equation, and I'll bring it down here. When you look at this equation, your constant and your coefficient are always on the same side as the variable. So this is your constant. It's your plus minus value with integer chips. It's a positive 4. This is your coefficient. It's how much variable you have. In this case, you have -5 x's. On the other side, you have -2. So your constant is 4, and to get rid of it, if I was modeling it, I would put -4 on both sides. So therefore, your constant is 4, and therefore you're putting -4 on both sides. And the answer is you would not do that first. You would subtract 4 from both sides, or add a -4 to both sides. The third question says the value of x in the equation -2x equals -10 is positive. Now, the interesting thing about this question is I had so many people that told me, no, it's negative because it's -2x. And the question was not what is your coefficient. I had nothing to do with what is the value of the coefficient. If you were to solve this using opposite operation, you would find out that the value of x was 5. So going back to the question, the value of x in the equation -2x equals -10 is positive. The answer is true. In fact, it's a positive 5. That's the value of x. In question 4, the constant in the equation 2 groups of x minus 4 equals -8 is -8. The answer for this is true, and there's 2 ways you could have done it. You could have taken your equation, and you could have expanded it using distributive property. So remember that this says 2 groups of x minus 4. So if I was to draw, using modeling, one group of x minus 4 and another group of x minus 4, from a modeling perspective, this is what 2 groups of x minus 4 looks like. And when I draw it, I can clearly see that the amount of integer chips, or my constant, on the side of my variable is -8, and therefore it's true. Another way you could have done it is expanded using distributive property. 2x's is 2x, and 2 -4's is -8, and if you expanded it using distributive property, you would also see that your constant is -8. Because you don't have one -4, you have 2 -4's as a constant. Question 5, the coefficient in the equation 4 minus 2x equals 10 is 2. The answer for this is false, and here's why. If I bring down my equation, and if I was to use opposite operation, well, let's just draw it first. There's a positive 4, there's -2x, and there's 10. If I was to get rid of my constant by adding -4 to both sides, I would end up with the exact same thing as doing this, subtract 4 from both sides. But what I'm left with after I get rid of the constant is negative 2x equals 6. And therefore the coefficient is not 2, it's negative 2. And question 6, if I were to draw a model for 5 groups of x minus 10 equal... Oh, I don't have this on your test, do I? Is this on your test? No. No, what's the actual question on your test? My apologies, I had the wrong question. So here's what it really says. It says in the equation 2x minus 11 equals... What was it? 2x. Oh, 2x equals 11, sorry. 2x equals 11. It is impossible to solve because 11 is not an even number. The answer, of course, is false. Because if I was to actually isolate the variable, x would equal 5.5. So it is possible to solve. It just means that your value of x can be a decimal. And at the very first of the year, there were students in this class that said, we can't do that because x can't be a decimal. So the reason why I put that question is because I want your thinking now to advance to the point where you understand that answers to x values can be fractions, they can be decimals, they can be negative integers, they can be irrational numbers, they can be whatever you want them to be. Now we have questions 7 to 10, which we want to model. So the first one is model 2x minus 1 equals 7. So I'm just going to use 2x minus 1 equals negative 7. First picture. Now, a lot of people just did this in the first picture, and that's fine. They put positive 1 on both sides. But your next picture has to be 2x equals negative 6. And then you take your x's and divide them evenly onto 2 scales. Take your negative 6, divide them evenly on the other 2 scales. And you end up with the solution of x equals negative 3. In your second question, a third of x minus 1 equals negative 3. So here we wanted to draw a third of x minus 1 equals negative 3. Now, if you did this in your first picture, that's okay, but you add 1 to both sides to get rid of your constant. Now, right here, I wanted you to draw a third of x is equal to negative 2. Now, ideally, what I want you to do here is, even on the same scale, it's okay to do this. If you had a third of x and you triple it, and you triple this side, these 3 x's together, these 3/3 of x's, excuse me, we're going to make a full x, negative 6, and therefore x equals negative 6. In the fourth question, 3 groups of x minus 1 is equal to negative 6. So there's one group of x minus 1. There's a second group, and there's a third group of x minus 1. Equals negative 6. So if I did it like this is what the picture would look like from a modeling perspective. Now there are 2 ways to do it. I'm going to show you both ways. So if I take this and clone it, bring it over here, take this one and bring it over here a little bit more, I want you to consider the following. The first way you could have solved it was, of course, adding 3 to both sides to get rid of your constant. That would leave you with 3x's equals negative 3, and then each of those x's would therefore have a weight of negative 1, or x equals negative 1. That's expanding using distributive property, because really what I did when I drew that is I really drew 3x minus 3 equals negative 6. Right? I expanded using distributive property. But over here, what you could do is you could have divided it into 3 groups anyway. So if I was to cut this into 3 groups, okay, just divide not after the constant, but before that. What I'm really doing is I'm taking this idea and I'm dividing it into 3 groups. And each of those groups is x minus 1. So if x minus 1 equals 2, I could add 1 to both sides, leaving me with x equals negative 1 as my solution. I don't expect anyone to draw this one. I never even talked about it, but it is a way that we could have modeled that question, dividing each group of the x minus 1 into 3 different groups, and then solved it that way. but it's okay if you didn't. Question 10, is it modeling? Yes, it is. Negative 2x minus 2 equals 6. So here we're going to have negative 2x's minus 2 is equal to positive 6. First thing I'm going to do is add 2 to both sides to get rid of your constant. Next picture will be negative 2x's equals, there's now 8 over here. I'm going to be lazy. 8 of them. And if negative 2x equals positive 8, then each negative x is equal to 4. Each negative x is equal to 4, and therefore, if I reverse it, each positive x would be worth negative 4, and that means that my solution is x equals negative 4. Questions 11 through 14 says solve by inspection. Write an appropriate question for 1 point and a solution for 1 point. Do not use opposite operation. So, the first thing I wanted you to do was say, what number multiplied by negative 2 is negative 12? That's really the question you're going to ask yourself to figure out the answer using inspection. What number multiplied by negative 2, is positive 12, not negative 12? The answer, therefore, is negative 6. So x will equal negative 6 because negative 2 times negative 6 is 12. So you got 1 point for this and 1 point for this. Now, you didn't have to have exactly that sentence, but something, a variation of that, was necessary for your other point. Hank had the best answer here. He said a negative tenth of what number is 1? That was a pretty brilliant answer, but the one I wanted everyone to say is what number divided by negative 10 is positive 1? That's really the question I was looking for, but I liked his better. And the answer is negative 10, because negative 10 divided by negative 10, or any number divided by itself, is 1. So you got 1 point for a question and 1 point for the solution. Now, a lot of people had this written wrong. It's not x take away 5 equals negative 1. It's 5 take away what number is negative 1. 5 take away what number is negative 1? Well, 5 take away 5 is 0, and 5 take away 6 is negative 1. So therefore, the answer is... Question 14, what number, subtract 4, is negative 5, or negative 5? What number subtract 4 is negative 5? The answer is x must be negative 1. Negative 1 take away 4 is negative 5. The rest of the questions, except I should actually say 15 to 22, it says use opposite operations to solve. Show all work seriously. So the first thing I wanted you to show me in the first question is simply dividing both sides by a negative 2, not a positive 2. And x would equal negative 5. You got 1 point for your work, 1 point for the solution, 2 points for that question. Next question, you have a negative half of x. So you're going to multiply both sides by negative 2. X will equal the product of 1 and negative 2. There was somebody that multiplied 1 times negative 2 wrong and got something different, but 1 times negative 2 is negative 2. Question 17, 5 take away x equals 7. Now, I told you this was a two-step equation. So the first thing I wanted you to do was subtract 5 from both sides. Now, a lot of you messed up right here. After you subtract 5 from both sides, you still have a negative x left. It's not x, it's negative x, equals 2. What I wanted you to tell me is, if it's a negative x, the coefficient is negative 1. And the step I wanted you to show me is dividing both sides by negative 1. Now, we're on the honor system. If I missed this, this was a 3-point question. For some of you, I missed some, I gave you full marks when I shouldn't have. So we're on the honor system. If you didn't keep your point. However, I want you to make the correction on the test. If I gave you full marks for that question and you didn't put it in, please make sure you copy it out just like this. Because I want to make sure you divide both sides by -1, because that's the coefficient. Your next question says -8 equals 2 minus a fifth of x. First thing I wanted you to do for a point was subtract 2 from both sides. -8 and -2 do not make -6, people. It's -10. -10 equals. Now when you're left with this, which is what's left here, I must have told you 1,000 times, take this negative symbol, because it is a -5th of x, and put it with your denominator. So when I rewrite it, since it doesn't matter which way you declare a -5th, it could be -x over 5, x over 5 negative, or x over -5, that's all still a -5th. Write it like that because it helps you with your next step, which is multiplying both sides by -5. And x will equal a -5 times a -10 is a positive 50. And that's your solution. Your next question, -10 minus 2x equals 18. Get rid of your constant by adding 10 to both sides. Please pay close attention to what your coefficient is. It's now no longer 2x, it's -2x. And -2x equals 28. 18 plus 10 is 28. There's a lot of people that put 8 for that. I don't know why. And now that you have -2x equals 28, divide both sides by -2. And x will equal -14. A lot of people had this question wrong. Your next 3 questions, and again, we're on the honor system. If you solved by inspection, okay, there were people who thought the solve by inspection went sideways on the test to the other one. If that's you, you need to be able to demonstrate the ability to solve these questions without inspection. You need to use opposite operation for these. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you the answers, and you're going to copy them down if you solve by inspection. Make sure you copy it out on your paper, even if you receive credit for getting it right by inspection. Correct. Some people solve by inspection. So the first thing you're going to do is subtract 5 from both sides, and you have a -10th of x is equal to, now, 4 and -5, if I was to draw using integer chips, there's 4, there's -5. A positive 4 and a -5 make a -1. Not -9, -1. And then you multiply both sides by -10. And 1 times 10 is 10. A negative times a negative, is a positive. So your answer is positive 10. Your next question says 2 groups of x minus 4 equals 12. So there are 2 ways you could solve this question. The first way, I'm going to clone this for a second. Bring it over here. First way you could solve it was by expansion. So if you had 2 groups of x minus 4, you had 2 x's, and you had 2 -4's, which would be -8. And you would have this as your first step. You would then add 8 to both sides, and 2x would equal 20. And you would divide both sides by 2 to get x equals 10. That's if you solved it using distributive property. If you solved it using division first, you would divide both sides by 2, and instead of saying 2 groups of x minus 4, by dividing by 2, you say 1 group of x minus 4 equals 6. Add 4 to both sides, and x would equal 10. Obviously, dividing both sides by that coefficient of 2 made everything easier, but either way, you ended up with the same answer of x equals 10. And the last question in your opposite operation is the question that probably, I don't know how many, I would say over half the class made the same mistake. So here's the mistake everybody, or half the people in this class made. So they expanded using distributive property. And they said -3x, and then they said -30 equals -33. The problem with that is that -3 multiplied by -10 is not -30. It is +30. So your constant in this equation is not -30, it's +30. Over half of you made that exact same mistake. And once you made that mistake, everything else you did was wrong. So you subtract 30 from both sides. Negative 3x equals. Now look, negative 33 and negative 30 do not make negative 3. It makes negative 63. And when you divide both sides by the coefficient, x will equal a positive 21. And that's your solution. X equals 21. All right, your next question was fairly easy, I thought, but a lot of people lost a lot of marks. It was just basically, do you know what coefficients and constants are? It's 8 points. I honestly thought it was my Christmas present to you, but a lot of people had 0 out of 8 on this, and it's unfortunate because that's a lot of marks on a test. Copy and complete it. So what's the coefficient? So the coefficient is how much x you have. How much x do you have? You have just one of them, so your coefficient is positive 1. What's your constant? It's your integer chips on the side of the x. Your constant is negative 2. Now, if anyone had anything wrong in this table, it's usually the very next question. What's the coefficient? How much x do you have? You have half of it, but you have a negative half. So your answer is negative 0.5 or negative 1 over 2. What is your constant? It's positive 4. It's the integer chips on the side of the variable. What is your coefficient in the next one? How much x do you have? You have negative x, which means your coefficient, although not written, is a negative 1. It's a negative 1 coefficient. And what's your constant? A positive 4. And in the last question, how much x do you have? You have negative 2 of them. So your coefficient is negative 2. And what's your constant? It's 5. 8 points for that. So out of a test of 63, that's 1/8 or 12.5% of your test was on that one question. So if you bombed that, you lost 12.5% on one question. And your very last question said, Mr. Mack decided to take his grade 8 math class on a field trip to the dairy bar. He told each child to bring X dollars with them. However, each student brought $2 less than they were supposed to. If Mr. Mack has 20 students in his class, and after he took all the students' money, he had $130, how much money was each child supposed to bring? So I changed the value for this, so we'll ignore this, because this isn't what I really want. I want you to do a whole bunch of different things. The first thing I want you to do is say, X equals money each should have brought. So X is going to represent, the variable X is going to represent how much money each student should bring. Now, if I define X minus 2, X minus 2 is going to be how much each student brought, because they brought $2 less than they should have. So I'm going to write that down as X minus 2 is how much money each student actually did bring. And if 20 students brought X minus $2, what the connection you had to make was that 20 students multiplied by the amount of money they brought, which was X minus 20, that expression represents all of the money the students brought. That would be all of the students' money. Okay? And here's why it's important, because if 20 students each brought X minus $2, and all of the students actually had $130, then I can change that wording of all the students' money into $130. And now what I've done is I've created an algebraic equation that says 20 students each brought X minus $2, and the total was 130. And if I isolate the variable of X, I will know how much money each student brought. Now, obviously, most of you, if given a distributive property, would expand it, giving you 20x, not minus 2. About half of you put 20x minus 2 as your equation, but it's 20x minus 40 equals 130, because you have to expand using distributive property. Add 40 to both sides to get rid of your constant. You'll have 20x equals 170. Divide each side by 20, and x will equal 8.5. Now we're not done yet, because x equals 8.5, write a therefore sentence, and since x equals 8.5 and x also equals the money each student should have brought, therefore each student should have brought $8.50. Now there was one person who said 8.5 is $8.05. But what you have to know is that $0.5 is not 5 cents, it's half of a dollar. And half of a dollar is 50 cents. So 8.5 is $8.50.